What's so special about Wisconsin, anyway? I mean, my home state, New Jersey, has tomatoes, Sinatra, Springsteen, Atlantic City, the Turnpike, and The Sopranos. And if you don't like that, I'll tell The Sopranos. What's Wisconsin got? Cheese, the Green Bay Packers, cheese, comics, cheese. Did I mention cheese? Okay, I'm not much of a cheese eater or a Packers fan, so according to my notes, we're apparently talking about comics in Wisconsin. And that's actually in capital letters, Comics in Wisconsin, as in the title of historian and activist Paul Buhle's new book by that name. Buhle, who has written more than 40 books on pop culture so far, has documented the origins of comics in his home state. This project details the development of homegrown talent such as Denis Kitchen and connects the cheesehead dots to Robert Crumb, Lynda Barry, Bill Griffith, and many more. Comics in Wisconsin is at least Buhle's second book published this year. He also collaborated with his old friend Kitchen on The Art of Harvey Kurtzman. Paul, welcome to Mr. Media.
Thanks very much. Glad to be here.
I'm glad you're here too. No cheese though, okay?
Okay.
Hey, Paul.
Yes.
Go ahead.
I say it's reflexive for everyone who lives in Wisconsin or greets anyone in Wisconsin to force cheese curds on them, possibly deep-fried cheese curds, which are among the most dangerous foods to eat, possibly worse than Big Macs. But, hey, it's the dairy state.
Do they taste any better than pork rinds?
I think in the same, I only had them deep-fried once, and I'd say very close to pork rinds.
All right.
In cause and effect.
Well, Paul, the folks in New York City and Los Angeles don't even know how to find Wisconsin on a map. How can you convince them of its importance in comics history?
I think that for East and West Coasters, and I've been both for certain periods of my life, everything in the Midwest is flyover territory. Yeah. And they might land in Chicago or have trouble landing or taking off because O'Hare is so difficult. But Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, Illinois, Ohio, and Iowa all sort of merge into one state or one geographical territory and remains something virtually unknown. But Wisconsin is a little different for a variety of reasons. Madison, which we Madisonians refer to as the Athens of the Midwest, not just jokingly, is this old progressive state going back to the days of Robert La Follette and resistance against the U.S. entering World War I and resistance against big swindlers on Wall Street taking everything over and so on and so forth. And that tradition is pretty tenacious and crosses all existing political lines. And that's an important piece. And then there's Milwaukee, which had a socialist mayor until 1960, and a lot of oddities about the state that come from it being a refuge for people from Illinois, Iowa, and other places who are seeking something rather different.
So it's a refuge, or is it like Australia is to England, a place where they send all their criminals?
Well, I defected from Illinois, to be perfectly frank, okay. And I'm not going back. It's a well-known fact that Al Capone vacationed or hid up here. That may tell us something, and was caught. That may tell us something else. But it's got a lot of woods and a lot of water, and it's a good place to escape to, and it used to be famous for its skinny dipping.
All right. Now, when you write a book, though, and you call it Comics in Wisconsin, I think the implication is that you believe there's something special about comics in Wisconsin. What is that?
Well, in one sense, it could be a story about regional art in any number of places, and you might find in that place, even though it isn't New York or the Bay Area, something which offered a microcosm of a larger artistic or cultural development someplace else. Some of the most important early comic art in the newspapers to establish continuity, that is a sort of day-to-day story narrative, was from people either was in Wisconsin, born in Wisconsin, or sort of moved to Wisconsin once they got their gig set up at the Chicago Tribune. That's sort of an accident of fate, except for Madison, if you have talent and you're young, then there's always this sense you need to go to Chicago or Los Angeles or New York City. Before 1930, Chicago was definitely the place. But, things changed because Madison was, by the 1960s, the late 1960s, one of these big countercultural centers where all kinds of things could happen, reputedly on the low-price marijuana belt across the United States. It was cheap and it was good. And there was a vibrant anti-war movement, a vibrant counterculture, and so forth and so forth. It was a great place to be. And out of the countercultural spirit, which was bigger than Madison, but included in Madison, came a phenomenon like Denis Kitchen, who ran for lieutenant governor in 1970 on the ticket of the Socialist Labor Party, an archaic socialist organization, which is sort of a deep Wisconsin story for Denis Kitchen. But as for me, I also passed through this archaic organization when I was about 18. It also indicated some kind of interest in history for its own sake. And in the 1970s and 1980s, Denis Kitchen did a lot of fabulous things, including publishing gay comics, first time this had ever been done, publishing a lot of wonderful art. But among the most notable things certainly was publishing these archives things from Will Eisner, Harvey Kurtzman, and a variety of other artists whose work had never really been collected, nor if they were still alive, were they encouraged to come back from the past of comic art and come into the present and make a stake for themselves in the future. So Denis was an archivist for the importance of comic history, quote-unquote classic history within comics. And in that way, from the little town of Princeton, Wisconsin, he made a very big impact. I would say if there's something in the last section of the book that's as distinct as these two, probably not. It would be connected with me and the reinvention of comic art as a form of telling social history. In addition to those two books you mentioned this year, also appeared The Beats, Harvey Pekar and myself telling a narrative story of the Beat generation for people who were younger than 25 and not likely ever to have picked up Jack Kerouac, etc. And also something I'm very happy about, an adaptation of Studs Terkel's very famous oral history book called Working, about the working lives of perfectly ordinary Americans, which is great because Harvey Pekar is sort of like Studs Terkel, still around for us and explored in a different sense. 36 years in a Veterans Administration hospital in Cleveland. He's the very sort of person that Studs Terkel looked for, found, and gave voice to. So, these are, for me, important steps in creating a new kind of comic art. Is it accidental that I did it for Madison? I don't think so, any more than doing an adaptation of Howard Zinn's famous People's History of the U.S. in comic form with artists, writers, and me, editor, all sort of in and around Madison. These are the sorts of books, I might call them radical history books, that a Madison person would naturally do.
Now let me ask you about Denis. Was he? You described him as an archivist. Was he necessarily an advocate of Wisconsin art talent, or was that more incidental to where he was?
In some ways, yes. In some ways, it was simply convenient. He was a young guy without a lot of financial resources, without a lot of contacts. And when he first began publishing a newspaper in Milwaukee, and then later in the Fox River Valley, he drew as much on local talent as he could. Well, these were young guys who were working cheap, and he was in face-to-face contact with them as opposed to being in San Francisco with Crumb and all the rest, or the New York scene, which peaked very early, disappeared, and then, of course, came back again. So it was convenient for him. but also he believed in nurturing local talent.
And how did you and Denis connect? At what point did that
that's
happen?
an interesting story, yeah. I was living in Madison in 1970, and I had just produced a thing called Radical America Comics, which was written entirely, or rather edited entirely, by Gilbert Shelton, from who was just en route from Austin to San Francisco. I got several $1,000 together and laid it on Gilbert, and he and a couple other people were able to establish Rip-Off Press, which was the second of the independent comics, underground comics presses in San Francisco. This was a great thing. It was probably the only time I published an issue of a magazine that didn't lose money over a period of 15 or 20 years. And also it put me in contact with Denis, and Denis was able to deliver to me an address for Harvey Kurtzman, which to me was just marvelous and wonderful. I wrote to Harvey Kurtzman in 1970 and told him he was the idol of my childhood. I'd written an English paper in high school on him, and he'd been a huge disappointment to me because he'd turned from Mad Comics to Little Annie Fanny. And Harvey Kurtzman wrote me back and said that his later magazines had all been financial failures, and he had to pay a mortgage, and he had children growing up, and that's the way life is. It was a tremendously candid response, which touched me deeply, and was really true.
I was going to add.
Yeah, I was going to say this little piece drew me and Denis closer together, I'm sure. And Denis gave me, carefully wrapped in plastic, loaned me some old issues of Humbug and other things that I never could have gotten my hands on of the Kurtzman tradition. And, we were both Kurtzman devotees when most people were forgetting that Harvey Kurtzman had ever lived and what he'd done.
So, and did Denis publish work by you during this period of time?
He invited me to become a comic script artist, but this was just about the time that I and a circle of people were leaving Madison for the Boston area. I was publishing this social history magazine called Radical America, whose purpose was to discover sort of grassroots sources for movements of social change. And so I separated myself from Wisconsin, something I really regret in retrospect, for decades, and fell out of touch with Denis, more or less, until close to the new century, when, for a variety of reasons, we started getting back in touch and thinking about things and so forth. And then it seemed as if a collaboration on this Kurtzman thing was something we'd both wanted to do for a very long time.
And this was actually a project that took a long time, wasn't it?
Well, I guess you could say that it's a project of a lifetime for him and me. I'm older than him. I'm now 65, so I was able to fall in love with Mad Comics in the original. And he came to it later, but boy, he was a lot more consistent than I was, and he managed to get stuff out while Harvey was still alive, which Harvey and his wife Adele were enormously appreciative of, and for that he deserves great credit. So he had this idea. A couple people tried to make a documentary film about Harvey's life in the early 90s after Harvey's 1993 death. Nothing came of either of these projects. And I know he was thinking about something like this, but I am guessing that it was the appearance of the Comic Art series at Abrams and this wonderful, wonderful editor, Charlie Kochman, who is also a deep devotee of Harvey Kurtzman, that made the whole thing possible.
One of the things that I got from this book, Comics in Wisconsin, is this sense, and we haven't spoken before, we don't know each other that well. I get a strong sense that you have a real radical past that keeps coming out around the edges in this book. Am I wrong?
Indeed. Well, I haven't thrown any bombs, if that's what you're asking. My great-grandfather was an abolitionist from Illinois who marched with Sherman through Georgia, and my mother was a bit of a feminist, the kind that voted Republican all of her life but resented those Wall Street characters. And when I was just about 15 years old, the first civil rights movement appeared in my hometown in the middle of Illinois. And I'd say reading Why We Can't Wait by Martin Luther King and joining the picket line against discrimination were the most exciting things that had happened to me in my life, even better than the no-hit game I pitched for a Little League team. And that was probably bigger for my father. And from there, marking time, reading the Beat Generation stuff, and that sort of mood, I, to my great surprise, became a spokesman for the Students for Democratic Society chapter on campus in the demonstrations of the fall of 1965, as I was to learn later, because almost everyone in the chapter was Jewish and from Chicago, and they wanted to put a Gentile downstate face on the movement. And all these things sort of projected me forward. Then by the time I got to Madison in 1967, I was among a generation of radical historians, young people who believed that by looking at the past of ordinary people, blue-collar movements, women, non-whites, etc., we were going to rewrite the history of the U.S., and it would change society in some fundamental way or urge the changes forward. I'm pretty sure we were confident until Ronald Reagan was elected, and then our confidence fell apart. But we really believed in telling history and finding new ways to tell history. And it was a natural thing for me when I landed in Rhode Island to found with the head of the bus drivers a Rhode Island Labor History Society, and then interview a range of old-timers and get their story of what had happened in this sort of defeated blue-collar state. And likewise, around the same time, to launch something called the Oral History of the American Left at New York University. And in a way, although I didn't realize at the time, this was all about getting stories, individual stories, the true stories of people's lives, or true to their own understanding of themselves. So when I was given the opportunity to do a comic history of the Students for Democratic Society, and I ran into a snag, it was just too close to me somehow. I got an accidental phone call from Harvey Pekar asking about something or other, and I glommed onto him and asked him if he would write the narrative for that. And from then on, it's been in very much the same direction. He's the savant, I'm the editor. And together we and a dozen artists seem to form a pretty good team.
There is a strong, we talk about comics, but I wonder if in this book, if we're talking largely about comics with an X, as an underground comics, and certainly a lot of the people we've talked about. And that, I think, the whole, the radicalization of the United States in the early 70s, mid-70s, late 60s even. I know Denis has always felt a part of that. Did this type of comics connect well to, radical politics?
Well, I was a huge comic book fan, as was everybody my age, more or less, just before the Boomers and during the Boomers' years. But among my total favorites were Classics Illustrated, which you always call Classic Comics. And I learned 35 years later that an elderly left-wing woman who I met in New York City had been a scriptwriter for Classic Comics. Well, it didn't surprise me at all. That I could remember most pages of William Tell, the struggle against the aristocracy and so forth, and the Mark Twain books that had been rendered in Classic Comics. Those are close to me. But at the same time, for me, Mad Comics and the early years of Mad Magazine told so many truths. They took apart so many myths about advertising, cliches about militarism. EC Comics had done the first realistic war comics ever done, etc. These, not something in Russia or China or somewhere else, were the sources of moving my mind in some kind of direction for social change and against empire, against wars, and all that stuff. So comics were always in the back of my mind, and I was unconsciously thinking about a comic art that would go that way. And then Gilbert Shelton sent me a copy of Feds and Heads in 1967, And it was amazing. Nothing like it had existed before. Underground comics were barely begun. And then I saw that something connected, and underground comics were going to dramatically change what was possible in comic art, as they did until they totally fell apart financially. And after that, alternative comics were not so close to me emotionally. I wasn't friends with the artists. But, you'd see people like Lynda Barry come forward in the 80s and 90s, and what they did was so strong and had so much appeal. You knew something was going on in comic art. Or I'd be teaching a big lecture course at Brown University on the 1960s, and Howard Cruz's comic Stuck Rubber Baby about growing up in the South, the underground gay scene in the South, and the social struggles, interracial stuff, and so forth. This was the one book my students loved more than all the other books I ever assigned. So it reinforced to me that there was something about comic art coming of age that was going to mean more and more for generations to come.
Well, you mentioned Lynda Barry, and you've mentioned Gilbert Shelton. Where does Robert Crumb fit into the history of comics in Wisconsin? Oh, gosh. He's huge for 1,000 reasons, and I have a review in the current issue of The Forward, which is available online, a review of his new book, Genesis. More than anybody else, he blew apart all of the existing limitations on what comic art could be, and not just for the U.S., but artists looking at him around the world. And the connection between him and Harvey Kurtzman is intimate and important. They really stand on each other's shoulders, so to speak, in the changes that they made. There's so many ways in which Crumb, in a moment of crisis or taking LSD, sort of recuperated the signage, the comic images, the way streets looked in big cities before 1940. He just sort of brought all that back through his particular comic art. He also was a history teller, although he wouldn't have put it as directly as that. And by 1973, he was America's favorite comic artist, but he wouldn't allow himself to be commercialized and so forth, and went through a lot of struggles and travails. But I think everybody would acknowledge that when his books were selling 300,000 copies, it was the epitome of youth culture's comic art creations. But did he ever spend any time in Wisconsin creating? Well, strangely enough, of course he'd visit Dennis as his publisher, right. And he had a series of pals in Wisconsin, still has one, and visits now and then. The spirit of comics in Wisconsin is not only people who lived here, but also what comics were being published here and what impact did they have elsewhere. And if not for Crumb, Denis Kitchen's operation would have been a lot smaller. Well, certainly, and I can certainly understand him. I mean, the image on the cover of your book is Crumb, and it certainly, it looks like Wisconsin. It certainly fits, and hell, we got to sell books, right? So, but I just I thought I don't remember seeing anything in here about him actually operating. Wisconsin's had a odd fascination for the comic artists from Chicago, because Wisconsin's just loaded with Chicago tourists for 6 months of the year. And Justin Green, later in Ohio, and Bill Griffith in Connecticut, and any number of other people, they too found in Wisconsin some weirdness that appealed to them. And often, as Bill Griffith in particular did, it's a middle American strangeness that then he drew about and offered some kind of interpretation of. It's like another universe in some strange fashion. Well, before we run out of time, I want to challenge you here. Now, I've just appointed you to the Wisconsin Chamber of Commerce. Tell me why an artist would find Madison or Milwaukee or Princeton, for that matter, a great place to live and create art. I'm not sure we want any more to compete with the ones we have. But Madison, by virtue of having a sort of radical mayor in the 1970s who you suddenly saw policemen have mustaches and stop arresting people with a joint on the street,
and became probably the most gay and lesbian-friendly city in the Midwest, et cetera, was just an enormously attractive counterculture place with now a lot of establishment support for artists. It was one of the biggest book festivals in the country is taking place here in Madison this weekend. So for a whole lot of different kinds of artists, Madison is just a terrific place to come, and if they could do it, to come and live if they can bear 7 bitterly cold months a year, which not everyone can. But for other people, it's as it is for Chicagoans, great to visit, sketch, think about, and go back to where they came from.
Got it. And I must say that I was at the I guess it was in 2005. I was at the Milwaukee Museum. Was it the Milwaukee Museum?
Oh, the Milwaukee Museum is the only place to have carried the full exhibit of classics, classic American comics, and that's sort of important. Milwaukee has that tradition.
Well, and I was lucky enough to be invited to come up there and talk about Will Eisner during that.
Great.
And it's a wonderful museum. I was kidding.
It is great.
When I opened the show talking about Wisconsin, I actually fell in love with Milwaukee. I love Miller Park. I love there's a market, an indoor market.
Yes, a great
wonderful.
place.
Cab drivers were great. It's a great place.
It is.
Paul, can folks find you in any of the social media places? Are you doing Facebook or Twitter, MySpace, any of that kind of stuff?
Facebook, yes. I don't believe I'll ever Twitter in my life. But, you can find me online in various places. Paul Buhle Comic Art is the easiest thing to Google, and then a whole bunch of stuff will come up.
Great. Well, folks, listen, you can find Paul Buhle's new book, Comics in Wisconsin, or The Art of Harvey Kurtzman. Those are two different books. Don't expect to get a discount. They're two different books. And you can find them at great bookstores everywhere, or you can order them on MrMedia.com or Amazon.com. And, Paul, thank you so much for joining us today on Mr. Media.
Thanks so much, Bob. Catch you later.
Pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Take care. And, folks, for more interviews with your favorite comic book, comic strip, or graphic novel artists and writers, surf over to our main website, www.mrmedia.com. That's where you can listen to my earlier conversations with Josh Neufeld, Patrick McDonald, Christopher Hart, Ray Billingsley, Jerry Scott, Rick Kirkman, Jim Borgman, John Rosenberg, Stephen Pastis, Mark Tatuli, Mort Walker, Denis Kitchen, Drew Friedman, Dave Gibbons, Joe Sinnott, Howard Cruz, Mark Chiarello, Freddie Williams, Gene Colan, and many more. And please think about writing an online review of Mr. Media, casting a vote for Mr. Media, or marking Mr. Media as one of your favorites, whether you listen on Blog Talk Radio, blogcritics.org, TrueSlant, Pointer Online, Digital Journal, Vox, Mediafly, Podfeed.net, Blueberry, Zencast, Zimbio, Current, or Odeo. And subscribe to Mr. Media on iTunes, and you'll never miss a show. Just search Mr. Media Interviews from within iTunes and subscribe for free. Or subscribe to Mr. Media's blog on the Amazon Kindle Reader. You can also listen with a piece of string and a tin can in many locations. If you've got an idea for a guest, email me directly at bob@andelman.com. You can also follow me on Facebook or on Twitter, www.twitter.com/Andelman. Thanks so much for joining us today. Always appreciate when you give up a little piece of your day and come spend it with us.